heading seaboard.
This could be a surprise missile attack.
Arctic permafrost thaw plays greater role in
What is this thing?
than previous.
It's an asteroid, sir.
Sir, our best estimate is 97.6 billion.
It's the size of Texas, Mr. President.
COVID thinking is critical in certain elements of the scientific establishment in the past for underplaying or completely ignoring the impact of methane when we do this predictive modeling.
Big overnight breakdown in social services worldwide. Rioting, mass religious hysteria, total chaos.
It's enormous.
Greetings, friends. I'm Arnold Schroeder, and this is Fight Like an Animal, and you can find the bibliography for this episode at againsttheinternet.com, like maybe 5 to 6 days after the episode itself, because it takes me a while. I often cite things from memory, and this process has never... It's never gone terribly wrong, but then sometimes it takes me a second to scour the world for the actual citation, put them all together, and I can't think of a better way. I can't think of a better way to spend election eve than releasing an episode that is not about how we can prevent terrible things from happening, but how we can undo terrible things that have already happened, right? It actually truly does seem appropriate to drop an episode that isn't about the election, but is about how to undo terminal wounds inflicted in the earth. And so this is about greenhouse gas removal protocols, both as both in terms of the actual protocols in a technical sense, what they are, and the stage of development that they're in, but it's also sort of an assessment of the perceptual landscape that exists around them, and what worldviews essentially will encompass this as a possibility, and which ones haven't, and what sort of syntheses are necessary to come to terms with the notion that it is in fact too late to talk about. I earnestly believe that we have crossed climate tipping points, and that even if we all chose to hold hands and sing and plant gardens and never drive a car again, at this point, I think that processes that we've already set in motion, the consequences that we have guaranteed but have yet to experience, would guarantee a mass extinction, certainly on the order of the previous 5, but I would say probably bigger than any of the previous 5, and conditions which the vast majority of humanity can't survive now. Can a tiny echelon of the ultra-rich live in an underground bunker in a subterranean Whole Foods beneath the tar sands that they mine to produce the energy for their hydroponic organic tomatoes, as storms rage over the Venus-like storms scour the largely lifeless earth? Sure, seems totally plausible, but in terms of the vast majority of life itself on this planet and the vast majority of human potential, I think we've essentially already condemned it all to extinction. And so the question becomes whether we can undo some of the damage that we've done. And I realize that, even though I do talk about it some in this episode, I realize that that there's always been this real huge deficit that I've seen in doing climate politics, and I have been haunted by it and talked about it with people often over the years, that if one doesn't read scientific papers, I've used to feel anyway, and maybe the popular media landscape around climate change is better, and I just need to look around a little more, but I used to really feel like there was just no way to really understand the extent of it, and the stuff that was publicly available and accessible in terms of like length and format, really understated the severity of the crisis. So I got a message about this today, asking if I had good, like recommendations for good stuff that's just sort of like climate fundamentals. And I realized that the answer is that I simply don't, unless somebody wants to read like a cubic yard of science. So I guess at some point I'd like to just actually do a climate fundamentals episode. I think even people who pay, like it's always good to have a recent synthesis. I always learn new things every time I read like a new IPCC report, or a new like literature review or whatever that wraps up what a lot of like the newer results. And then I also wanted to give a big shout out to I went on the From Alpha to Omega podcast to talk about all this work that I'm doing with this podcast, and the notion of integrating cognitive science and evolutionary theory, psychology and things like that into revolutionary political theory, how that should serve as like a foundation from which political theory emerges. And it was an amazing time. We talked for like 4 hours, something like that. So at the moment there's 2 hours of it up. There's a part 1 and a part 2. It's the From Alpha to Omega podcast. So please do check that out. It was a great time, and probably something to be said for actually having a conversation. It definitely changes one's delivery, and I just thought it was a great experience.
We'll expand to deploy fleets of direct air capture facilities capable of removing gigatons of carbon from the air.
We need you to prep the team we're sending up. We'll send them to the asteroid. They'll land, they'll drill a hole, they'll drop some nukes, take off and detonate, if we can fix this equipment problem.
We can blur the line a little bit between analogy and homology here, which is always the systems theory thing to do. That's kind of always. So I agree really strongly with Melanie Mitchell in her book Complexity: A Guided Tour, where at the end she talks about how systems theory has like advanced all of these different scientific disciplines in all these ways. It's provided all these really powerful insights, and it's clearly like it clearly refers to something, but that to really actually know what the fuck it is, or to really characterize its insights in a fundamental way, we would need another conceptual revolution, perhaps another set of like mathematical insights on the order of like what Newton did with calculus for physics. But so systems theory, like one of its central insights is that the behavior of complex systems at a sufficient level of abstraction can be like the same mathematical descriptors can be used for, like brains and the internet and an ant colony, right? Or whatever, for any number of complex systems. And so like I think that blurs the line between analogy and homology, because I want to make a distinction from a lot of the homologies that I describe in this podcast, which are much more concrete and definitive, like in terms of behavior, the sort of gold standard, where if you see similar behavior and then you observe that activity in similar brain regions and similar like neurochemical signatures and hormonal signatures are correlated with that behavior, that's the point where you say the behavior is homologous. And then everything else is an analogy, everything that's mere comparison. But with this stuff, like when you're talking about similarities between complex systems, it's kind of somewhere in between. Like you're not saying that there's like physically something that's conserved across these systems in the same way that there's an evolutionary conservation of like brain structures and neurotransmitters and hormones and whatnot between, say, like humans, elephants, and rats, and chimpanzees and whatever else. But you're also not, it's not mere comparison either. You are saying, like, again, at a sufficient level of abstraction, you can use the same math to characterize these systems. And so anyway, I mean, I think that one like semi-analogy, semi-homology that we can describe from systems theory is the notion that the earth and a body, say the body of a human or whatever kind of animal, share some properties and have some things in common. And I think that using that analogy, it's pretty easy for us to say that both can die, right? That the subcomponents of either of those complex systems can start interacting with one another such that the parameters of all the subcomponents start getting really out of whack really quickly. Values start to exceed typical ranges really quickly, and there's like a rapid decline. And that's right, like if you have a heart attack, then the parameters of like a bunch of your other physical systems are suddenly going to go out of whack, and they're going to start feeding back on each other and devouring each other in all these interesting ways. And so the other analogy that, or homology or whatever it is that we can make out of this is that it's possible for either system to be in a state that requires some kind of intervention. Like, in other words, what I'm saying is that the earth is in a state such that it needs something analogous to medical intervention, pretty significant medical intervention. Although we'll describe in this episode kind of like a range, like we'll use that conceptual structure and we'll describe a range of interventions that kind of do exist on a continuum from, like taking medication to, I don't know, like having having a transplant, or like staying on some kind of life support forever or whatever. I flipped through a book or two because I wanted to like read a quote to justify this comparison between planets and bodies, or our planet in any case, and bodies. And I just kind of got lost in a lot of really beautiful equations and graphs and maps of ant colonies and brains in the internet. I didn't quite find the perfect quote, but it's out there somewhere. I swear I'm not making this all up. And then, like really another one of the moral hazards or whatever of talking about things in these terms, another reason people have really exhibited an aversion to it is because in addition to potentially inducing a sort of like apathy or like a lack of urgency about the climate crisis, like talking about negative emissions, giving people a sense that we should just continue on this trajectory and wait for a technological miracle to make it all okay, is like the fear that it'll just induce total fatalism to say that we're at this point. And that's a really interesting, I mean, I think that people often find themselves in a little bit of a like rigid, I think people have internal dialogues, the subset of the human population that really thinks about climate change, that is, does find themselves often in these kind of like internal dialogues where there's a war between two really strict binaries, and one is like there is hope and one is there isn't hope, or one is it's too late and one is it's not too late. And it's really interesting. I've actually seen people progress through these states in like the course of 2 or 3 minutes. I've totally had conversations with people where they were asking about what I do, and kind of trying to fit it into the conceptual framework of their own lives. And they literally went from, are you sure this is really a problem? Should we really even worry about this? To, well, it sounds like it's an insurmountable problem, or it's probably too late. So should we really worry about it? And I'm like, well, it's interesting that you're able to acknowledge two ends of a very long continuum, both of which imply that you should just keep doing exactly what you're doing, but nothing in the middle of that continuum. But people have a psychological need for cognitive closure. That's a that's a psychological category all its own. Like, regardless of what people are thinking about or what they think about it, psychologists measure the extent to which people just need to come to some conclusion about things, and that's a way that people vary. Some people are willing to endure, engage, encompass whatever, a lot more complexity and ambiguity than a lot of other people, and I think that's exactly where we are. It's actually this really crazy, in some sense, really thrilling moment. It's a moment that really makes you like take a deep breath and think about your own agency and the exquisitely strange reality that we occupy, where we just don't know. We just don't know how much harm is possible to avoid, and we just don't know how much potential for survival there is for how much of the life of this planet, including our own. And it's just kind of amazing, but it's all evolving really quickly, and there really is it's a very open-ended question. And so meaningfully participating in the ecological trajectory, it requires understanding that things are much, much, much worse than is conventionally acknowledged, and at the same time being willing to entertain pretty expansive possibilities about interventions. So I don't know. I think it's kind of exciting.
Removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is no longer an option. It's a necessity.
Why don't we just send up 150 nuclear warheads and blast that rocket apart?
So I don't want to spend too long justifying the statement that the Earth is terminally ill. I just think that the case has been well made by others, but I will justify it. There's any number of ways that you can approach this question and come to this conclusion. Like I said, the evidence is converging from all the fuck over, from all these different components of the global ecosystem. I mean, one very simple way, even though the IPCC methodology is profoundly biased towards understating the severity of the crisis that we're in, is to look at the carbon budget that they articulate for any chance of staying under 2 degrees, and then looking at the geophysical uncertainties that they estimate. And again, like these geophysical uncertainties just don't take into account major dynamics that have actually been the driving force in past mass extinction events and that are very much happening right now. So, pretty major oversight. But like literally in the same table on page 108 of the most recent IPCC, I think it's the most recent IPCC report, the one from 2018. You can look at this table where they describe the gigatons of greenhouse gas uncertainty and the carbon budget, and if you add up all of those uncertainties, they exceed by a considerable amount the remaining carbon budget, right? So it's like 770 gigatons to, I forget actually which confidence interval for which degrees that might be to retain a 2/3 chance of 1.5, which I think is beyond tipping points, but and then so it's 420 gigatons to retain a 2/3 chance of 1.5 degrees. And then there's 770 gigatons of geophysical uncertainties that they acknowledge. But I mean, probably most notably, there's a number of oversights, but probably most notably the IPCC just doesn't talk about methane, or they just don't factor it into their modeling and their carbon budgets and their trajectories. And yeah, I mean, but they do, like, they acknowledge that they're not acknowledging it. They just like talk about it in their report, and they say models and field studies show high agreement that permafrost thawing will release both CO2 and methane as the Earth warms, amplifying global warming. field, laboratory, and modeling studies estimate that the vulnerable fraction in permafrost is about 5 to 15% of the permafrost soil carbon, or roughly 5,300 to 5,600 gigatons of CO2. So if we're talking about carbon budgets of 420 or any of the other numbers they articulate for other confidence intervals or for other for other degrees of warming, I mean this is just like way outside those ranges, and it's happening right now, right? So we can also think about this. I mean, there's basically that I personally know of, and it's been a long time, honestly, since I've really like tried to do a comprehensive review of the climate literature, and it's expanding really fast, so that does get harder and harder. But I mean, like, there's three feedbacks that I know of that have all really clearly been triggered, and one is forests, right? When forests start burning faster than they can grow. And 2018 was the first year that somebody released a scientific study saying that exactly that was happening, that global forests have become a net emitter of carbon dioxide. And one is the loss of ice, and you do not have to go far to find some scientists saying they've never seen anything like this, and a piece of ice the size of, half of Texas or whatever just fell off of Greenland or Antarctica, like that is clearly well underway. And even if the feedbacks themselves weren't accelerating climate change, I mean, we have decades more of warming just from the actual greenhouse gases we've already emitted. So ice is looking pretty doomed. And the permafrost is melting. The methane hydrates underneath the ocean and methane underneath the ground, underneath what was previously permanently frozen ground, that is being released into the atmosphere right now. And the thing about that is that if you examine the history of life on Earth and the other big mass extinctions, this can happen in a very, very rapid pulse. This is exactly what motherfuckers mean when they say non-linear, right? And so we could get like a giant burst of methane at kind of any point right now. A Guardian article that just came out a few days ago called "Sleeping Giant Arctic Methane Deposits Starting to Release," scientists find. And they talk about how this is kind of really the big one. This is like the big climate feedback that could totally induce like really, really, really rapid chaos. It hasn't yet. Like, most of the methane is not entering the atmosphere yet. Most of it is dissolving in the ocean and things like that. But it's been perturbed, and the process will continue, and it will continue in a nonlinear fashion. Maybe one more way to kind of justify this notion is that environmentalists for a really long time have been playing this game where they're like, we have approximately 7.5 years to reverse course before it's too late or whatever. And we have totally crossed the line of some of those too late thresholds that were articulated by really smart people. Like, I mean, Christina Figueres and others, she was the head of the IPCC, I guess, in 2017 said that 2020 was the latest that we could possibly radically reduce emissions, right? So fucked that up.
Many people now understand the need to address atmospheric carbon dioxide.
With the proximity of the asteroid and no prep time, none of our primary plans can work.
Okay, but true to the nature of this show, we're not just going to talk about negative emissions technologies. We're going to talk about like kind of like the perceptual landscape in relation to negative emissions technologies as well. Who is having conversations about this? Who isn't? What kind of underlying assumptions about the world value systems and metaphors, perhaps often unarticulated, are being applied to the ecological situation by different like factions of people that would allow or prohibit them from discussing this, or would tend to make them discuss it in more or less destructive and stupid ways. Because I actually think it's basically meaningless to talk about this stuff if we don't map that out. The climate crisis didn't just happen to us. It happened because people are certain ways, different people are different ways, and some of those people have particular forms of power that other people lack. I am somebody who thinks that there are really almost infinite degrees and varieties of climate denial, or ecological denial in general. There's the very obvious one, which is just saying that none of this is real and science is a conspiracy and whatnot. But the market will save us is climate denial. Net zero by 2050 is climate denial, and so is like some of the framing of like radical justice oriented groups, climate justice is social justice, and all we need to do to solve this crisis is to prioritize the voices of frontline communities. That is also fucking climate denial, but both in the sense that I think it proposes a socio-political response that is a little inviolable, but also, like I said, it just doesn't acknowledge where we are geophysically. And, I really do want to emphasize that for a very long time, I also assiduously resisted these kinds of conversations. And I think that was valid and wise. I think that, we don't know how much of this harm we can undo. So until we crossed these thresholds, the thing that did in fact make the most sense was to be like, yo, let's stop causing the harm. But so I think that I am one of the only people, I might be the only person who has kind of like participated in the political milieus that I have, like the only person who's like run around the country organizing blockades of oil trains and things like that, who's also doing literature reviews and podcasts about negative emissions technologies. So, within the landscape of sort of like radical politics and like people coming from like an egalitarian perspective, or just like a really, I think that these things are pretty intrinsically related to one another. I don't think there's that many people who have like a fundamentalist ecological outlook who aren't basically really egalitarian in some ways. I think that you have to essentially have empathy with the whole world to have a fundamentalist ecological outlook, so like people in like egalitarian politics, or in like really like like environmentalism per se, radical environmentalism of various degrees, just really aren't talking about this. And I think that we can look at this in terms of like language and framing around ecological issues that all kind of reduces to something about harm avoidance. And perhaps you recall, if you are a devoted listener to this podcast, in episode 1, we talked about a paper called I think the title is Basic Personal Values and the Meaning of Left-Right Political Orientations in 20 Countries. But these researchers created this like this values survey that had opposing poles. So like security versus stimulation is one like axis, with like those as the endpoints of that continuum. And, the more that people value stimulation, the more egalitarian their political outlook tends to be, even though that's not like logically related in any particularly clear way. So it's good evidence of the kind of like deep underlying psychological differences that map out to differences in political orientation. But then, another one of those axes is benevolence versus accomplishment, right? So, I think most people would guess, the further you are along the continuum towards the benevolence end, the more egalitarian your politics tend to be. The more you tend to orient towards framing around reducing harm and not causing harm, and intervening in harm that's being caused by others. But so it's interesting that the opposing pole is accomplishment, because people who are more on that end of the continuum are going to tend to probably be more receptive to the idea that we should deliberately, massively change the Earth's basic processes of functioning, even if it is to diminish harm, or so that we don't all die. Like, the very idea of exerting that level of agency is going to appeal to people who live in one set of metaphors and frames more than people who live in another. And I actually really think, perceptions of environmental issues did not start to become so polarized until really just a handful of decades ago, right? Richard Nixon said things signing what remain most of the federal environmental legal framework in the United States into law about environmental issues that you could not get executive directors of major environmental nonprofits to say today. And I think that, when people who work on these issues are just utterly baffled, how can these people allow the world to die? Don't they love their children? It's really hard to overstate the extent to which a big part of that is because discussions of these issues are framed, maybe not explicitly, but in the language and metaphors, they're framed in egalitarian terms. One book I really love is George Lakoff's, I think that's how you pronounce his last name, Moral Politics, How Liberals and Conservatives Think. It was written in the 90s, but it's good because he really goes through tons of examples of political discourse and shows how so fucking much of it, talking about all these really heterogeneous, complex issues, really do rely on a very recurrent set of metaphors about families and growth and limits and all this stuff. And so he talks about a moral model that, a set of metaphors that are based in families that people with more hierarchical outlooks tend to use, which he calls strict father morality. It's worth reading a little bit of it. Strict father morality is organized around the strict father model of the family. There's a group of metaphors for morality that fit naturally with that model and are given priority by it. Those metaphors for morality have entailments that go far beyond the strict father-family model. When taken together, the entailments of those metaphors define a well-organized and far-reaching moral system. Here is a list of the metaphors discussed and the ways that they fit together in the system. Moral strength. This spells out the crucial notion of self-discipline as characterized in the family model and extends it to morality in general. Moral authority. This builds on parental authority in the central model and extends it to morality generally. In the process, it characterizes a notion of legitimate and illegitimate moral authority. Moral order. This legitimizes the strict father's authority in the family model and is important in defining in general what counts as natural and hence legitimate authority. He goes on, continuing on the strict father morality model. In the central model given above, a set of dominance clauses, namely, God has dominance over human beings have dominance over nature, animals, plants, and natural objects, adults have dominance over children, men have dominance over women, are mapped onto a corresponding set of moral authority clauses. In particular, God has moral authority over human beings. Human beings have moral authority over nature. Adults have moral authority over children. Men have moral authority over women. So he contrasts this with what he calls nurturant parent morality, which I think no one will be surprised to hear he describes as a set of moral metaphors for people with more egalitarian politics. He says empathy is the basis of a major conception of morality. Morality is empathy. The logic of empathy is this: if you really feel what another person feels, and if you want to feel a sense of well-being, then you will want that person to experience a sense of well-being. Therefore, you will act so as to promote a sense of well-being in that person. And then a little later, nurturance presupposes empathy. A child is helpless. It cannot care for itself. It requires someone to care for it, and to care for a child adequately, you have to care about a child. You have to project your capacity for feeling onto a child accurately enough to have a sense of what that child needs. This not only requires empathy, it requires constant empathy. It also requires, to a significant extent, putting the child's needs before your own, making sacrifices for your child, though not so much that it prevents one from nurturing adequately. And so I may not really be able to make the point in this episode, but like I said, in this book, he does a really good job of just going through, of just like really digging through, endless permutations of political dialogue as it existed in 1994. But you can still kind of clearly map this out to the present day, and just describing how this like really, really limited set of like proto metaphors and like kind of like archetypal forms of reasoning just get applied over and over and over again. But I think that his work has been largely validated in the domain of ecological issues by more recent research. So, for instance, this paper called "The Moral Roots of Environmental Attitudes," to quote from that, "Recent decades have seen ever-increasing polarization on environmental issues, with liberals positioning themselves as guardians of the environment and conservatives generally opposing reforms intended to protect the environment. One reason for this polarization may lie in differing perceptions of whether environmental concern is a moral issue. Such views may emerge from the type of moral rhetoric with which environmental concerns are typically discussed. In the studies reported here, we investigated the possibility that liberals, but not conservatives, view environmental issues in moral terms because of a tendency for these issues to be discussed in terms of harm and care-based morality, moral concerns that resonate more with American liberals than with American conservatives. And additionally, individuals who score higher on self-transcendent values, i.e. placing the interests of other people ahead of their own, are more likely to feel moral obligations toward the environment." So again, the point I was just making, I think that people who are like real ecological fundamentalists are essentially experiencing empathy with the entire world and essentially applying most of the time some version of these like harm and care based frameworks to other species and to like fundamental physical processes that make life possible. And so, these researchers got conservatives to care more about environmental issues in a statistically significant fashion by framing them in terms of in-group loyalty, authority, respect, purity, sanctity, these other themes that those kind of people really like. And then another study, and I think these guys did an amazing job of really just like nailing the language. Like they were like, what are all the metaphors? Let's put them all into a paragraph. Like what are the left frames? What are the right frames? And how can we how can we employ every single one of them in like 5 or 6 sentences? So they got similar results using environmental messaging oriented towards the left or the right. So, I don't think I have to clarify which one is which here. The first one reads, "Show your love for all of humanity in the world in which we live by helping to care for our vulnerable natural environment. Help to reduce the harm done to the environment by taking action. By caring for the natural world, you are helping to ensure that everyone around the world gets to enjoy fair access to a sustainable environment. Do the right thing by preventing the suffering of all life forms and making sure that no one is denied their right to a healthy planet. Show your compassion. As opposed to, show you love your country by joining the fight to protect the purity of America's natural environment. Take pride in the American tradition of performing one's civic duty by taking responsibility for yourself and the land you call home. By taking a tougher stance on protecting the natural environment, you will be honoring all of creation. That's with a capital C, by the way. Demonstrate your respect by following the examples of your religious and political leaders who defend America's natural environment. Show your patriotism. And, both these examples read to me as very over the top, but so does most political language. So, I don't think they're off. And like I said, they managed to get statistically significant variation in support for environmental policies among people with different political orientations by framing these according to the metaphors that they actually use.
Removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is no longer an option. It's a necessity.
Why don't we just send up 150 nuclear warheads and blast that rocket blast?
And so, just to give like one example of the kind of like exclusive focus on harm. This is from a pamphlet that Rising Tide North America put out, and I'm not trying to. I've worked with a bunch of Rising Tide collectives up and down. Well, not really up and down the West Coast, but throughout the Pacific Northwest. But you can really see not only the exclusive orientation towards preventing harm, but in this case the kind of like exclusive orientation towards preventing harm in human communities, the kind of the really like justice oriented end of the climate movement. And I don't mean, I want justice and everything. Justice is a good thing, but that has like pretty specific connotations, and one of those connotations is like a pretty exclusively human focus, like a tendency to militate against actually talking about ecological issues in anything remotely like ecological terms, and to kind of constantly reorient those conversations back to this notion like, well, you can't make any progress on the ecological crisis without addressing people's suffering, which I actually really do agree with, but there, you also have to like have a fucking plan for dealing with actual ecological issues. Like ameliorating people's suffering in and of itself won't do it. And this tendency, and this is kind of like one of those places where you can really see how, as we've talked about in past episodes, how the academic framework, the like social constructivist academic framework that constantly asks us to not like look concretely at things, but to always be asking, especially like physical things in physical reality, but to always be asking what contingencies or flaws in our perspective exist and what unconsulted perspectives we need to incorporate to like have a better understanding. Everything is a social construct. Somebody punches you in the face, it is in fact a social construct on some level. You can't escape the web of interpretations and somewhat socially contingent meanings. And so this is always true. You can always learn more about what you think you know by consulting other perspectives, but you can also get lost in a loop where you're literally only doing that and never coming to terms with your imperfect epistemology and fucking doing something with it. So anyway, to quote a little bit from this Rising Tide pamphlet called Hoodwinked in the Hothouse, which is about false solutions to climate change, and does in fact contain a section on geoengineering, although back when it was written I think they were right to just completely write it off. That's what I was doing too. But so here are their four, here are their four like strategies in a sense for dealing with climate change. They're four like sort of solutions, but they're not really solutions. There's just sort of like principles that you would apply to a solution, but then since there aren't really any concrete solutions, really, it's kind of, it is what they're offering. So, work towards a new economic paradigm based on the limits of ecological sustainability and people's needs. Ensure the rights of local communities to democratically determine the sustainable use of their food, water, and energy use based on sufficiency and equity. Recognize inherent and customary rights of indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent regarding all resources on their traditional lands. Support just transition strategies for all workers towards safe, meaningful work free from exploitation. And again, none of that stuff is bad. That's all. I mean, the first one of those is just like, it's just like some self-referential thing. Like, what should we do? What should we do to stop the ecological crisis? Oh, well, we should acknowledge ecological limits and live within them. It's not, but the other three are definitely just about like consulting people and refraining from harm and like allowing people greater degrees of self-determination, and those are all really good things, and in and of themselves they just don't do really anything about the ecological crisis. But so then to like really like, it's not like, I mean, the right per se is just not even interested in the ecological crisis. They just are pretending that it doesn't exist. But but we can look at this like kind of other sector, which is definitely, I think the people involved in this sector are on that benevolence to accomplishment continuum, definitely like further towards accomplishment, right? And their language is really interesting. This is like the faction of people who actually are talking about greenhouse gas removal protocols tend to have like less radical perspectives in general and more of a tendency to justify the behavior of the socio-political system they inhabit and to make it sound like relatively reasonable and benevolent. And so as the ecological crisis has progressed, this has painted them into some interesting corners. They talk a lot about technical feasibility. They talk a lot about economics, but then they do this thing where they just talk a lot about it's like they've been forced to just like say that aggressive, meaningful action on climate change is like somehow a socio-political inevitability. It's really interesting. Like the more clear it's become that it's really not, and those in power are, yes, in fact, stupid and ugly enough to just let everything die, or I should say rather to kill everything, the more that they have kind of like rigidly retreated into these statements about how it's just somehow like an inevitable trajectory that we're on, that carbon dioxide emissions just will reduce. I really noticed a threshold got crossed, like a major phase transition with this after the 2015 climate talks, the Paris Accords, because they were so like monstrously stupid, right? And just totally like a recipe for systemic ecological collapse. And that was really the point where it seemed like a lot of this sector of people just started talking about carbon dioxide emissions like they were inevitable. And so like I said, just like a lot of talk about technical feasibility and economics. Here's like a typical headline from like that sector of society. Machines that suck CO2 directly from the air could cut the costs of meeting global climate goals, a new study finds, but they would need as much as a quarter of global energy, right? So you see it all right there. Cut the cost, like, so they're sounding reasonable. They're like, this is obviously going to happen. Obviously there's such a thing as global climate goals, and obviously we're going to meet them. And, so like the thing to do is to talk about how to optimize the costs. or like another characteristic turn of phrase from an article from this sector of the landscape. How much CO2 will need to be buried? They're talking about geological sequestration of CO2. Obviously, it's impossible to know in advance. IPCC models vary in how fast they show emissions falling. The faster and sooner emissions fall, the less carbon capture and storage will be necessary. So, again, it's like the emissions are going to fall. It's just a matter of which IPCC trajectory we're going to be on. And the real question is just like, how much? It's not like, can we undo the harm we've done? It's like, how much carbon capture and storage will be necessary? Like, let's do a technical feasibility assessment and run some economics on it. So I think that both of these approaches are insufficient. But even though I acknowledge that if I were to belong to one camp or the other, there is one camp I have definitely spent more of my time and energy and life in than the other. But as is so often the case, I propose a synthesis. And this is where we kind of get into acknowledging that we simply do exert a kind of executive control over the global ecosystem, whether that's something that we feel particularly comfortable about or not. Right, this is the sort of the Anthropocene narrative, or all the varieties of it that are about that are about acknowledging that humans just are a fundamental driver of global dynamics, and we don't get to walk away from that even if it makes us uncomfortable. And there are many varieties of these narratives, including many that I find repulsive and stupid, that somehow transition from that acknowledgement to the claim that that global ecosystems should be managed exclusively for narrowly defined human needs, which I think is the opposite of seeing the point. But so I want to quote from in 2014, this journal started called the Anthropocene Review. And, I read the very first issue of it thinking, I guess mostly expecting, because there's, again, the Anthropocene narratives are multifarious, but I figured that this would be the geologists trying to come up with these sort of formal criteria, in geological strata, signatures of human activity, coming up with some kind of sufficient level of abstraction to compare the geological signature that humans have left to past geological signatures or whatever, because that's part of this whole there's this faction of scientists who are trying to get, I totally don't know what the organizations are, but the big geology organizations to formally declare that the Holocene has ended and we have entered the Anthropocene. But what actually happened, I read the journal cover to cover, or in any case, I don't have a physical copy, but I read the whole thing in sequence, and I have to say, it was one of the more bewildering, hallucinatory voyages that I had gone on in a while. Multiple instances in different papers of people questioning the basic premise that technology is evolving not only to serve human need, any clearly definable human need per se, but even just really as a function of human agency of any kind, just this, this systems theory notion, that we inhabit a universe where there's just been this tendency towards greater complexity, and it just that emergent complex phenomena just keep developing out of the emergent complex phenomena that were already there, and that the evolution of technology is just best thought of as a continuance of that trajectory, and not something that we're creating as the masters of to meet any particular need, any more than one thinks of like an organism as something that's created by the cells to meet the needs of the cells or whatever, right? So like that was fun to see in a scientific journal. And then I don't know, stuff about the techno fossil record, right? That idea of like if there's a fossil record and now there's a bunch of stuff buried in the earth that is like made out of metal or whatever, like again trying to create these formal criteria to map human impacts to like methods of more like geological assessments. So like stuff about technostratigraphy as opposed to just good old fashioned stratigraphy and like I don't know, it's great. Stuff about how humans have actually increased the number of large-bodied vertebrates on the planet by an order of magnitude. But it's just all like 3 or 4, domestic species and ourselves. But so to quote from one of those papers in that journal, it is only after the start of the Industrial Revolution that this imprint has evolved into a major force, talking about the human imprint, impacting many global biogeophysical cycles to the point of becoming a strong, integral, and in some respects dominating force in the Earth system. In recent years especially, an unprecedented degree of global economic, cultural, and political interconnectedness has also developed. The increasingly globalized human social system is thus also a key feature of the Anthropocene. While it may be premature to talk about an integrated human society, the ongoing dynamics point in this direction. Science can help lead this evolving global society toward greater awareness of its impacts and guide it toward responsible, wise use of the resource system upon which it depends. The capacity of systemic self-organization on a global scale also enables human society, at least in principle, to use Earth system knowledge for self-governance. A little later on, this has the effect of breaking down the dichotomy between humans and nature at the functional level, which, in turn, brings into question the appropriateness of much previous thinking and writing about human-nature relations, since the human-nature dualism, as conventionally framed, no longer provides an adequate basis for assessing the functional dimensions of human-environment interactions. And then in conclusion, the overall aim of the new journal, therefore, must be to communicate clearly across a wide range of disciplines and interests the causes, history, nature, and implications of a world in which human activities are integral to the functioning of the Earth system. And, so I think some basic framework is really necessary for us to confront what is actually happening right now with both courage and wisdom. The courage to intervene in ways that we just do have to intervene, but also the humility and wisdom to understand that we are in something infinitely complex, and to eschew narratives of like domination and of control per se. I think that we have to look at, relying on the notion of a sort of like overall trajectory towards greater complexity and integration that we just described with reference to technology for ourselves. Like we have to see, if our evolution represents a phase of nature becoming aware of itself and of organisms becoming increasingly able to decide the nature of their behavior and their ecological trajectories, their modes of subsistence and whatnot. I mean, I think there's another way that we have to we can look at every species as a functional aspect of like an integrated ecological system, a global ecological system. And I really do think that we have to see ourselves as like an executive aspect of that in some way, because we just are. We just don't get to walk away from that responsibility. I think going for the body analogy again, like we have to understand that we occupy a role in global ecological dynamics kind of analogous or homologous or whatever to a brain in a body, in our own bodies. So even though I couldn't find the perfect quote about like the similarities of complex systems, the mathematical descriptors at sufficient levels of abstraction that characterize the similarities between complex systems, I did, from one of the books that I leafed through, find a quote that I think is very salient to this, which is from a section of a book called Signs of Life: How Complexity Pervades Biology, one of my very favorite books in the entire universe. The section is called From Control to Participation in Science. Why are we stressing observers so forcefully in this context? It is to emphasize that with the sciences of complexity, the process of understanding the world enters a new phase, with two primary characteristics. First, control of natural phenomena begins to slip out of the grasp of observers, both because sensitivity to initial conditions severely limits the possibilities for prediction and control, and because emergent properties of complex systems are unpredictable from a knowledge of parts, so that deliberate manipulation of components brings unforeseen consequences. Second, these emergent properties can nevertheless be made intelligible in terms of appropriate descriptions of the processes involved by using high-level concepts that capture their essential aspects. How observers choose to act in relation to natural phenomena that are thus revealed to be unpredictable but intelligible is clearly open and unprescribed. The sciences of complexity show us that we are embedded in a world fundamentally different from that which has previously characterized modern science, with its emphasis on prediction and control of nature. We can clearly exercise whatever control remains possible in complex systems, but there are other options, such as participating rather than controlling. That is, recognizing that we can influence complex systems and proceeding cautiously with such influence because of the fundamental unpredictability of our actions and their consequences. We can no longer be naive observers who live outside the phenomena we manipulate. The properties of organisms, their development and health, the dynamic activities of brains and communities, the characteristic order of ecosystems, the patterns of evolutionary change are processes in which we are directly involved. For better or worse, we participate in them, and of course, we would wish to participate wisely rather than irresponsibly. And I think that's so beautiful. I don't know if anybody else in the world honestly shares my love of this book, but I think it's one of the most exquisitely beautiful things that has ever been made. And I think that phrasing, that notion that we have to acknowledge that we participate, but that we should engage in that participation without a sense of like control per se, is both a scientifically and morally necessary framework in which to operate. And so in that spirit, friends, let's now actually talk about let's talk concretely about the negative emissions protocols that I've studied. I'm sure there's some that I haven't, and what potential they offer for shifting the trajectory towards extinction that we're all on right now.
We'll expand to deploy fleets of direct air capture facilities capable of removing gigatons of carbon from the air.
We need you to prep the team we're sending up. We'll send them to the asteroid. They'll land, they'll drill a hole, they'll drop some nukes, take off and detonate, if we can fix this equipment problem.
So first, I do want to acknowledge that for a very long time, with respect to negative emissions stuff, the very worst ideas prevailed, and very little real progress of any kind was made. The fucking perennial IPCC obsession with biomass energy, with carbon capture and storage, BECS, I guess is the acronym, is illustrative. I mean, like characteristic characteristic discussions of negative emissions from like those sectors of society for the longest time is like, there may be some carbon sequestration potential in torturing fairies by pulling off their wings and harnessing the pain that causes them to like, sequester CO2, but the technology has yet to be developed to actually translate fairy pain into carbon emissions reductions, and also fairies are so rare they're almost extinct, so that might be a problem too. I mean, just like garbage, right? But in 2017, Jan Minks and others released a paper describing the trajectory of research on negative emissions and showing an exponential curve, pretty like that, kind of like recently really trended upwards on the subject. And I mean, I guess you could probably make exponential curves for most scientific publishing, but they also talk about the shift in the ratio, how papers about negative emissions are becoming a larger proportion of the overall like climate literature. So that's good. And then, different papers talk about this different ways, have slightly different categories. Sometimes like something that's treated as like a fundamental category in one paper is a subcategory in another, like biochar is sometimes a fundamental category, sometimes an aspect of soil sequestration. But to give some sense for just from one paper, there's a really vast range of estimates of the potential of these different protocols, which we will get into more. But this paper is on enhanced weathering, which is the first thing that we'll talk about in any kind of detail. But so enhanced weathering has a potential similar to that of other carbon dioxide removal strategies estimated for 2050, including bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, widely adopted in IPCC future scenarios, got that right, at 0.5 to 5 gigatons per year. Direct air capture and storage, 0.5 to 5 gigatons a year. Biochar, 0.5 to 2 gigatons a year. Soil organic carbon sequestration, 0.5 to 5 gigatons a year. And afforestation reforestation, 0.5 to 3.6 gigatons a year. And so to give some sense, I actually have no idea what emissions exactly have been like the last couple of years, but they're not radically divergent. I know that 2017 emissions, I think is really the last time I looked, were right around 43 gigatons a year globally. So, like in terms of, this is one of in terms of like how much is necessary or like by what, in what time frame, I mean, I just think that I think there's really no way to like definitively know that, but that the kind of ultimate answer is like like we should have as much potential as possible to do this as soon as possible. And so like none of these numbers are thrilling in the context of global emissions that are right now around 43 gigatons. Like all of those strategies don't sum to anything like 43 gigatons. And I think that we can't afford to have emitted as much as we already have. So it's certainly not that exciting to imagine that in 2050 we're still producing emissions. But they're just like, we're like taking some of it out with some of these protocols or whatever. But yeah, so I mean, to inject, I don't know, like nobody knows, but so maybe it's unrealistic hope, but it's not, because I'm not making any false claims about it, but to inject a sense of real possibility, I want to start with a discussion of enhanced weathering. Because the upper end of the range of its sequestration potential is fucking massive. So enhanced weathering and ocean alkalinity enhancement or ocean fertilization, these all go by a bunch of different names, enhanced rock weathering or whatever. But it's it's an acceleration of a natural process. So there's a certain amount of carbon dioxide atmospheric carbon dioxide that's sequestered every year by rocks coming into contact with water, dissolving, which releases like a bunch of ions that then come into contact with the air, which then bond with carbon dioxide and produce other compounds, some of which are in particularly short supply right now. Like for instance, carbonates come out of them. So like marine organisms with shells, all like, I don't know, maybe not all, but the vast majority have calcium carbonate shells. And so as the oceans acidify, the formation of calcium carbonate gets harder and harder. It gets eaten up by the acidic compounds in the water. These compounds that are formed by the dissolution of rock bonding with CO2 that often then run off into the ocean. So that's like it's both sequestering carbon from the atmosphere and reversing ocean acidification. And it's estimated that natural rock weathering sequesters like about 1 gigaton of CO2 a year right now. But so like getting into that, this is where the body planet analogy actually becomes kind of useful if we're going to talk about things that are analogous to medical interventions. Like getting back into that analogy, I think that enhanced weathering is like the medication option. I mean, obviously there's medication that fucks you all up, but it's like the fairly benevolent. It's like the pill you take that doesn't have a ton of side effects, and it promotes, it stimulates some like natural like process that your body actually like performs anyway, and and like and revitalizes it, accelerates it, whatever. So the idea of enhanced weathering is that these rocks, or like the particles, the dissolved rock particles, sequester carbon dioxide when like tiny little portions of them have crumbled away from the rock and come into contact with the air. And you can speed that up by just crushing rock, by having rocks just like crushed up and spread around. Like what you're trying to do is maximize the surface to volume ratio. And so that's not like the craziest thing in the world. So it's called enhanced weathering when this crushed rock is distributed over land, and then it's called like ocean fertilization or ocean alkalinity enhancement when you distribute the rock over ocean. And so as far as like a lot of the time, I mean, including like all of the IPCC trajectories involve all of this like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage stuff that just is not technologically mature. And like all the time when you see anybody talking some shit about like net zero by 2050 or whatever, it almost invariably involves greenhouse gas removal protocols that have yet to actually technologically mature. But like it's probably a fairly obvious point that crushing up rock and spreading it around on land or in the ocean there is just like no fucking technological barrier to doing that at all. And so different types of rock get discussed. I guess the most common is basalt. And the sequestration, the upper end of the sequestration potential for that it is like 5 gigatons a year. But then one that doesn't get discussed quite as much, but I really do think warrants a whole fucking bunch of attention, is dunite. And dunite could be a little more problematic. There are some compounds. No, they're actually just there's some constituent elements of dunite rock that would come out in the dissolution and the crushing in the enhanced weathering process that like probably wouldn't be great to like massively concentrate in water supplies and stuff like that. But really, like, that's the thing, is that we just don't know, because as much as it's well established that this can work, there has just not been a ton of like pilot projects with any kind of monitoring or anything. And so this is like a very recurrent theme throughout all discussions of greenhouse gas removal protocols, is like the ideas that are terrible and evil have received billions of dollars in funding, right? Like the ideas that are like, well, how do we keep how do we keep like blowing the tops off mountains in order to extract coal and burning it, but with less greenhouse gas emissions, like billions of dollars. And those projects have not fucking gone anywhere. But then like enhanced weathering experiments, it's literally like a handful of papers describing pilot projects that all exist on like just like actual research budgets, just like the budgets of like individual researchers who are like at universities and shit. But so the upper estimates of Dunite's sequestration potential are 95 gigatons a year. So that's an example of where we're getting into like that would be totally decisive. That would be incredible. I mean, if we could actually do that, I don't know. I mean, it would totally change the calculus of how many of us and how much of the rest of life on Earth is likely to survive for how long. I mean, just fundamentally change it. But, again, when Dunite is excluded, we are talking about much lower potential. For instance, this one paper published in Nature says our enhanced rock weathering scenarios correspond to an aggregate carbon dioxide removal of 25 to 100 gigatons CO2 if sustained over 5 decades. And like that, I don't want to remove 100 gigatons of carbon dioxide over 5 decades. I want to do it in a year, god damn it. But so that just like really remains to be explored. But again, like it is difficult to overstate how much this is like laying around to be explored. And the materials themselves are literally laying around because this stuff is already mined. And the mining process itself produces a fine powder. So it's like not to actually like affect its full potential, but to actually do some pilot projects and get like some real data from like it would be important to distribute crushed rock in like different settings, like different soil chemistries and like different rainfall regimes and things like that. But to quote from another paper, mining generates a continuous but often discarded finely powdered silicate byproduct that is utilizable for enhanced rock weathering. These materials have been accumulating worldwide for decades and may require no further grinding, thus lowering CO2 emissions that reduce carbon dioxide removal efficiency. However, national inventories of the location, availability, and extent of this resource are required to assess the potential contribution of this resource to carbon dioxide removal via enhanced rock weathering. And I'm going to like restrain myself from going on another rant about like, like this stuff is just like literally sitting around somewhere waiting for us to see if it'll save our lives. And this one group of researchers have done this. They took some mining waste and did an enhanced weathering pilot project with it. They used basalt. So crushed basalt as a carbon dioxide sequestering soil amendment for removal of atmospheric CO2 will be presented. Unlike previous studies that envisage energy and carbon-intensive mining, crushing, and transport of mafic or ultramafic rocks for accelerated silicate weathering, our focus is on the use of an existing basaltic rock waste stream as a soil amendment to sequester CO2 by chemical weathering. And yeah, they got promising results. They say the concentrations of two divalent cations that have the potential to permanently sequester carbon as calcium carbonate and magnesium carbonate in the oceans increased in the amended soil solutions over several months in the field experiments, almost doubling relative to the control plots. And so check it out. They were applying this rock powder to agricultural plots because not only does spreading some crushed rock that happens to be laying around in some like abandoned mine somewhere potentially profoundly impact the trajectory of the climate crisis, but it negates the need for as much fertilizer, and it increases crop productivity because it makes compounds more available to those crops. So these same researchers also say, at present, very few laboratory or field studies have been conducted with an explicit focus on enhanced weathering. Studies that examined rock powder as a fertilizer typically report crop growth and yield under variable rates of basalt powder application, but only occasionally provide ion concentrations of soil water or exchangeable soil fractions from which chemical weathering rates can be gleaned. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, somebody really ought to, one of those like billionaires who's standing, in front of some projector screen, giving an adoring audience their like portfolio of climate solutions that they're investing in, or I don't know, like some brave politician who is finding the courage to say that climate change is real and the science is settled and all that shit. Like one of those motherfuckers ought to like take some of that crushed up rock and put it around somewhere and hire a few people to measure ion concentrations in the water runoff. See what happens, right? So that's enhanced weathering. And I did want to lead with it because the potential of dunite is just so massive, and because the technology doesn't have to really mature at all.
Removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is no longer an option. It's a necessity.
Why don't we just send up 150 nuclear warheads and blast that rock apart?
Then maybe the next most promising approach, but this is way more in the body analogy. I mean, this is interesting because my kidneys don't work, so I think I'm a little bit of an expert in in like making the choices about survival that involve technological interventions that are often a little bit grim, and assessing whether it's all worth it and whatever. But this is kind of, I'm on dialysis, and this is kind of the dialysis option, right? I mean, really, like, not just in a like it's an ongoing technological intervention. It involves a bunch of big ugly machines or whatever, but like really more in a like a pretty direct way where like the purpose of dialysis is to diminish concentrations of certain substances that are circulating in the blood with a mechanical intervention, and then direct air capture is the purpose of that is to remove concentrations of certain substances that are circulating in the air. And the air, if you're into climate models at all, like, the sky is modeled according to fluid dynamics. It is ultimately kind of a liquid in a sense. But, so here we definitely get into stuff that would cost a fair amount of money, and to technologies that are still... I mean, they're online. There's pilot projects that are concretely demonstrating potentials, but it's not technology that has been like deployed massively. There's a few operational pilot projects that are currently actively capturing greenhouse gases directly from the air and sequestering it. One interesting one is the carbon engineering approach, and their pilot project is it in British Columbia? Certainly somewhere in Canada. I think British Columbia. But so since 2015, they've continuously operated a pilot project that captures 1 ton of carbon dioxide a day. So we definitely are not at like massive scales here yet. But based on the design, in consultation, I mean, I think that this is like fairly confident inference. They definitely consulted with a bunch of engineers and whatnot, and really just like a bunch of suppliers about scaling up. And because their design relies very heavily on existing cooling tower technology. Cooling towers have these like arrays of fans that are vertical, and so they modify this by creating these horizontal arrays. But so like they've talked with like suppliers of components that just already exist and are sold for other purposes about scaling up, and gotten cost estimates based on those discussions. And so that they have a model for a 1 megaton of carbon dioxide removal a day direct air capture system. So, that's not nothing. And so the cooling tower technology contacts the air, and then it captures CO2 in 2 connected chemical loops. It takes it into an aqueous solution, does some other stuff with it that probably I don't need to describe in any more detail, but the process does require a bunch of energy. And so the model that they have working now combusts natural gas. They capture the emissions from the natural gas. So that's existing technology, some kind of scrubber. So operating at full capacity, the plant that they model captures 0.98 megatons technically of CO2 from the air, but it delivers 1.46 megatons of like sequestered CO2 because it's also, the captured CO2 from the gas. And so they do a life cycle assessment of the like net sequestration that they would get from this configuration, and basically a good way to look at it is that 90% of the CO2 that they captured would ultimately be sequestered. So like there's some energy use there that negates some of the utility, but 90% is not a terrible number. And then like, the barrier here is that this modeled 1 megaton a day facility would cost $1.126 billion to build. So those that control all the money would have to actually give a fuck for this to go anywhere. But then they also model, and this is where we're getting into like a little more of speculative inference here, but they model that, like technological costs do drop as technologies mature. And so that's their estimate of like the very first one of that scale they'd build. And then eventually they think it'd get down to about $780 million. So, you happen to have that laying around. So you could imagine this scaling up and going somewhere. And this, the enhanced weathering thing is so exciting because it doesn't require like a crazy amount of money, and because it's not like this hyper technological, like I said, because it accelerates something that's actually just like an inherent function of the Earth system. But in many respects, direct air capture is the protocol that has the least uncertainty. Like we would just really still need to actually like do enhanced weathering at any kind of scale, try it out in a variety of locations, and like really see what happened. So like we know that here the barriers, there's no intrinsic barriers. It's just the barriers of money and social and political power. That's all. But like this could be scaled up and make a huge impact. But what about all that methane, right? So friends, check it out. A 2017 paper proposes a system for taking methane out of the atmosphere at scale. So it's really not that hypothetical. It's basically like just a combination of 2 technologies which have already been demonstrated. One of them is called a solar chimney power plant, or an SCPP, and the other is a photocatalytic reactor, or a PCR. So together they form an SCPP-PCR. But a solar chimney power plant is something I had personally just never heard a single thing about until I read this paper. But apparently one was built in Spain in the 80s, in the early 80s, 1982. And it was a 7-year pilot project. And so what this thing is a solar collector that's like a greenhouse, like a horticultural greenhouse. And its purpose is to concentrate hot air. And then that hot air is connected to a chimney. And so the hot air travels up, because that's what hot air does, through the chimney, and the chimney has a turbine. And so it gets turned by the movement of the air. So it's kind of like creating, it's kind of, it's basically like a wind turbine design, but you're creating the wind by concentrating heat. So this does have a fucking footprint, right? Like you gotta build like a big greenhouse. The 1982 prototype had a solar collector with a radius of 122 meters, and the solar updraft chimney had a height of 195 meters. So, and then it produced electricity. It had an output of 50 kilowatts. Industrial scale versions were modeled in this paper, and in other papers that they cited. This was like a big literature review on all the aspects of this process. So these like larger scale versions have been modeled featuring a 38 square kilometer solar collector. It would process 17 cubic kilometers of air a day with an output of 200 megawatts of electricity. But so then, like as these structures operate and all this air gets passed through them, air that has methane in it, the idea is to couple this existing notion of the solar chimney power plant with a photocatalytic reactor, which can be any number of structures that are, like kind of designed to like optimize surface area in contact with the air, like a honeycomb structure or whatever, that's just like painted with photocatalytic paint. They talk about a number of compounds, like titanium oxide comes up probably most often. So, like you paint these like honeycombs or lattice structures or whatever with titanium oxide or another photocatalyst. And when they come into contact with methane and other greenhouse gases, N2O, etc., it destroys them. It does, in some cases, turn them into carbon dioxide. So so then you still need a whole lot of the carbon engineering plants or whatever, or you need to crush up some rock and put it somewhere. But so at current greenhouse gas concentrations, one of these 200 megawatt, one of these like big industrial scale like modeled facilities would eliminate 1,000 kilotons a year. I guess, isn't that a megaton? This is directly copy pasted from a paper, but I think that's a megaton a year of CO2 equivalent, right? Any greenhouse gas can just be like converted to CO2 through some conversion factor or another. So you're just talking about, so you can just play with like one set of values, as well as avoiding emissions from electricity generation of 600 kilotons a year. And this assumes a certain emissions intensity for electricity. So if 100% of estimated 2030 global energy consumption, which is 8.8 terawatts, was provided by a 200 megawatt solar chimney power plant photocatalytic reactors, this would require 50,000 such devices, and it would abate 80 gigatons of CO2 equivalent a year. So, again, like, it wouldn't be cheap to build all of those, and they would have a fucking footprint for sure. But it's a hypothetical technical potential to be a complete game changer, to negate more greenhouse gases that are emitted in any given year by a considerable margin to like actually undo some of the harm. And crucially, it could potentially be a way to ameliorate, say, a sudden massive pulse of methane into the atmosphere.
Many people now understand the need to address atmospheric carbon dioxide.
With the proximity of the asteroid and no prep time, none of our primary plans can work.
Okay, and then, I'd be lying if I said any of the rest of these approaches were really all that nearly as exciting as the stuff I've just gone through. The stuff I've gone through is exciting because it potentially represents massive sequestration potential, and I think that's ultimately what is entirely necessary to aim for. But, we should go through some of these other ones that are commonly discussed and have potentials that, while not massive, are not trivial either. Biochar is one, so it has like an estimated, there's one paper I read that said that they estimated a 1.8 gigaton a year potential. Other papers say other things, but it's certainly never more than like 5 gigatons a year. So biochar is taking some stuff and burning it at a particular temperature, like over a long period of time, and then burying it in soil, and it radically rather increases the soil carbon sequestration activity. And then, so like that kind of falls into like this broader category of all these different methodologies that are intended to increase the potential of soil to uptake carbon dioxide. And all of those approaches cumulatively are estimated to have a potential to sequester about 8 gigatons a year of carbon dioxide. So, again, like not massive, but also not trivial. And so this is like, biochar is like the potential has yet to be like really clearly like, it's still kind of evolving, but some of these other approaches are very well developed, like cover cropping and stuff like that. And and at least it's nice because it doesn't, none of the soil carbon sequestration approaches require the development of any technology that isn't already laying around. And biochar in particular could actually generate, it could be sold to farmers or whatever. So instead of there being a cost per ton of CO2, you would generate, and there's one estimate like $60 to $70 per ton of CO2. And then I guess we gotta talk, because it comes up so fucking often, there's no way not to say something about it, but we gotta talk about, I'm gonna say it's all one category. I'm gonna say that afforestation and reforestation and all this fucking bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, sometimes also called biomass, right? If you've seen, like, if you saw Planet of the Humans, or you've seen any other environmental messaging about how like destructive and stupid and evil this is, it is, and it's just like crazy. It's so, I feel like basically I personally am competent in like a few different technical domains, or like reasonably competent, or like reasonably well read in any case. And some of those I feel like they make me sound like sophisticated and smart, like I feel like when I say like political orientation reduces to basic personal values, like, axes with these opposing poles, benevolence versus accomplishment or whatever, like I feel like I sound like well read or whatever. But then like another, so that's like one domain I feel competent in, is like all this stuff relating to like behavioral biology and cognitive science and psychology and whatnot, aspects of psychology. But then, another thing that I've just devoted a ton of my life to is like ecology and environmental policy. And I feel like when I talk about that, I just sound fucking crazy because I've read deeply enough that I just like I don't know what to say other than like it's all bullshit. There's nothing there. It's nonsense and garbage, and it's, I just like don't sound sophisticated. It's like one of those things. I was quipping about this the other day. Like if you say like if you read a climate plan and then you like speak in their terms, and this is so much of liberal psychology is this. It's like this motivation to sound sophisticated ultimately by acquiescing to the terms of the dominant social order, even if those terms are fucking meaningless. But so if you say like, well, reading the climate plan, it seems clear that the public transportation incentives described in it are insufficient to meet the vehicle miles traveled reductions targets in the plan. Like you sound sophisticated. You sound like, like, because you're speaking in the terms, right? But that requires assuming that there's like the plan actually has something to it, that there's something there. It's like you sound sophisticated if you address this like minor fucking vicissitude of policy. But if you just say like the policy is meaningless garbage, then you don't. And, but if you really read deeply into the climate plan, you're like, oh God, there is just nothing here. And I really feel this way. For me, like the 90s and early aughts were all about forest science and stopping logging and writing timber sale appeals. And, I spent a lot of time reading a lot of this stuff and all of this shit about like sequestering carbon with like forest management practices. And like, I just like, it's like impossible to tell if anything is there, but it's just really clear that they need to shut the fuck up about it. It's kind of like the forests as they were before industrial logging is just part of the planetary baseline, and the harm that we've done by cutting them down exists in addition to all the harm that we've done by like directly emitting greenhouse gases by like burning shit and whatnot. And so like as we careen toward extinction, the right approach is to just be like, yeah, that's just part of the baseline. Like let's just stop cutting down all the forests, and then let's also address all of this other damage that we've done. But what these fucking people insist on is coming up with all these hyper abstract to the point of meaningless schemes whereby, like damage that's being directly done in one domain is supposedly offset by not cutting down forests and all this nonsense. But like, so let's see, there a paper that got like a fair amount of attention, it was published in 2019, found that, I'll just read from it, we mapped the global potential tree coverage to show that 4.4 billion hectares of canopy cover could exist under the current climate. Excluding existing trees in agricultural and urban areas, we found that there is room for an extra 0.9 billion hectares of canopy cover, which could store 205 gigatons of carbon in areas that would naturally support woodlands and forests. This highlights global tree restoration as our most effective climate change solution to date. But then they also start acknowledging pretty early on in that paper that climate change itself radically shifts the calculus of how many forests it's possible to grow. 205 gigatons is a fucking lot, but I really don't know that it would be decisive or anything like that. That's like it's just like a handful of years of emissions at the current rate. It's and if we tried to create that extra 0.9 billion hectares, it would take a lot longer to grow than the time that's necessary to emit that amount of carbon dioxide. I guess that's one way to think about it. And then like the bioenergy with carbon capture and storage shit is just like, we don't know the sequestration potential. It gets estimated at like maybe up to like 5 gigatons or whatever. The IPCC models it as just like doing way more than that, but I don't understand why the IPCC does most of the things that they do. Yeah, and like very, very fundamental questions remain about the technology, like how, I mean, like fundamental. Like for instance, is the best way, like the carbon capture and storage part of the equation, the part of the equation that's not cutting down trees and burning them. Um, like would that work best as like a post-combustion carbon capture situation, right? Like so burning them for energy and then like scrubbing the carbon from the emitted carbon, or should this be a scenario where like vegetation is cut down and there's some kind of like fermentation process and there's a capture of the biogenic CO2 from the fermentation, decomposition? We're still asking these basic questions. And so like I don't know, maybe in some, but it's also just like the whole calculus, I don't know. I think it's a little too much to get into, but like it really just like the very notion that you're somehow like sequestering more carbon than a forest would already be sequestering by routinely cutting it down, burning the trees or fermenting them or whatever, and capturing that carbon, right? So you're always promoting new growth, but forests have this particular growth curve. Like they start sequestering maximum amounts of carbon dioxide when they're like older, when they're like close to 100 years old. I don't know. And then there's just such fundamental uncertainties. There was another paper that got a ton of attention that was just about Oregon. Well, first of all, in their modeling, bioenergy, even with carbon capture and storage, is a net emissions increase, which is what I've long suspected. But then also like the reason I'm actually mentioning it is because in their methodology, the net emissions from the timber industry in Oregon are 32.61 million tons of CO2 equivalent. And so that's like that would make logging the very biggest emissions sector in Oregon. Whereas before, like in official climate planning documents, like in Oregon's climate planning and policy documents, it's estimated at less than 5% of emissions, and this would push it up to like more than 30%. It's like the point I'm making is that like all of this forest carbon accounting is like really, really amorphous, and the more you go into technical detail about it, the more that you both are like, well, there's just really a bunch of uncertainty, but also like as much as there's a bunch of uncertainty, it seems like the common claims that are made about it in sectors like the IPCC are just like utter gibberish, just like meaningless. Okay, and then finally, I'm not gonna actually spend any time on any of these. These get no technical detail. These are all like totally emerging. We will not even begin to hazard estimates of sequestration potentials because I personally have encountered nothing of the sort in the literature. Oh, that's not true for algae. Whatever. I just want to like mention some of these other technological developments that are happening, more for the sake of giving some sense of like just kind of the basic reality. Like maybe some of these protocols that I just went through have tremendous promise. Maybe none of them do. I mean, I don't really know how direct air capture couldn't, but like whatever. Like maybe those aren't the right ideas or whatever. But like, I just want to give the sense that the technological landscape is evolving really fast. As much as money always gets put in the wrong fucking places, and if we had spent anything like the resources, time, money, and energy that we spent learning how to like drill horizontally for more natural gas, on like underneath some grandma's home in Pennsylvania or whatever, we could totally be living in like the kind of science fiction that we were hoping we'd live in instead of the kind of science fiction we were really hoping to avoid. But Yeah, so, but like, let me just like run through these. There's the algae thing. There's the idea that algae is like more photosynthetically productive than pretty much any other organism, and so there's this notion of enhancing its growth, of growing it in like special. There's a few different like approaches. Like some of them are like tubes, and some of them are just like modified pools, but these ideas of growing enough algae to just like massively sequester a bunch of carbon dioxide. And then this also becomes another bioenergy with carbon capture and storage thing, where they're then like, and then we could maybe like ferment or burn the algae and scrub the carbon emissions as they occurred, and then we would like, reduce like the emissions from electricity and create an economic incentive to do this. But unlike with forests, which are just like already there, and like it's probably not very realistic to talk about like increasing the area of forests all that much, especially as they happen to be burning the fuck up at unprecedented rates at the very moment. We could potentially do these like massive algae grows in like coastal areas that wouldn't support forests. In like places, access to water is a big part of it, but in places where there's not a ton of biological productivity, and thus it would actually add some sequestration that isn't just there in the Earth's baseline. And then like in a similar vein, and a very interesting thing to think about is synthetic biology and genetic engineering and some other stuff that I guess I don't even really know how to characterize, like a kind of combination of genetic engineering and just a sort of like laboratory directed evolutionary process has produced like some enhanced capacity for photosynthesis, and there's some aspects of the photosynthesis process that are like pretty inefficient. They definitely don't capture all of the energy that they come in contact with, and so there are some like promising developments in terms of like really ramping up the photosynthetic capacity of organisms, which could honestly be a fairly promising area. Another pretty wild thing that's happened is that some researchers managed to re-engineer. It was E. coli, because that's just like this model organism that gets fucked with a lot in a lot of labs, but they managed to re-engineer it to have plant metabolism, right? So instead of like requiring, instead of being like a heterotroph and eating something else that also ultimately required the energy of the sun somewhere, they managed to make E. coli like live off of like carbon dioxide and sunlight. So that's interesting because like I don't know. I mean, like potentially maybe could that be done with like some synthetic meat or something, right? Like could we potentially grow biological compounds that sequester massive amounts of carbon dioxide and replace, stuff that we currently consume that has a huge emissions factor. It's a wild landscape out there. There's all kinds of stuff happening. There's some people who synthesized a protein that produces electricity, like harnessable electrical energy. So again, like the point I'm making is I'm not really highlighting any of these as like something that should be done or something that specifically has a ton of promise, but I'm just highlighting them to give some sense of the reality that the technological landscape is emerging really rapidly. As so many people have commented, like this century may be defined more by technological innovations that involve manipulating life than by anything else. And like we just don't know. We just really don't know what the future holds. And if we are going to participate in nature, if we are going to accept the agency that we do in fact possess, and the effects that we do in fact inevitably have, and we are going to try to engage that agency wisely, then I think that we do have to move beyond the pure harm negation framework. And I mean, like, the people, like, it's a sign that somebody should have power if they question the nature of their power, right? And so, like, I think likewise, it's basically a choice between allowing people to control the dynamics of the Earth system who just don't fucking think about it, or to take power from those people, and for people who understand what a burden it is and have some sense of, like, the unknowable vastness and complexity, like, have some real humility before the Earth system, for people like that to begin to exert an executive effect on it. Those, I don't see a third path. Okay, so yeah, friends, thanks for hanging in there with me through all that. Fairly complex journey, but I hope you got something out of it. As I read these papers, I did this literature review for a friend, like, sometime earlier this year, and there were, like, some real twists and turns in there for me, and I definitely pay a lot of attention to climate. So I hope that you got something out of this, at least in the sense that there's a new way to think about something, or like, that you just actually learn something. Whatever you think of my perspective, ultimately I'm trying less to convince people that I'm right than to orient them to variables that I think are relevant. And the call to action that because if you read guides to how to make podcasts, they'll be like, always end with a call to action. And the one that I want to make this time is to write to me. I've been, like, fucking with the website a little bit, so I'm not going to try to give my email address is in the podcast description, or you can find it at againsttheinternet.com, because I finally actually added, like, a contact page and some other stuff like that. But I do sometimes get some really, for as much as I don't have a huge audience, I get some really substantial, interesting feedback from people, and it really keeps me going. So whatever you happen to think of this, if you love it or hate it, vehemently agree or disagree, I would in fact love to hear from you. So yeah, get in touch, and stay fierce out there, and we will talk again soon, assuming that we don't all die in the imminent civil war before I have a chance to record another episode. Take care, friends.
3 wild cards.